Over the years, GBC has been documenting the twists and turns of Gibraltar's history, from industrial upheavals, political achievements and important visits, to everyday life and community development. We now have a duty to preserve this insight into who we are and why.
There are different types of tape, and U-matic tapes, which are the first videotapes that GBC used back in the late 70s and early 80s, is where we have our oldest material. They started using that technology towards the end of us being in Wellington Front in the old studios, and then came up here to Broadcasting House, where the tapes accumulated over the years. But of course, videotape has a shelf life, and a lot of it has deteriorated over the years, and unfortunately it has been lost because it has not been digitised or transferred to new tape.
Tapes were lost during the move from Wellington Front to South Barrack. Documentation left much to be desired, and then conditions have not always been ideal. There are many factors which combined mean the task is a mammoth one.
The interesting, perhaps downside of it is that we're not really sure that everything that is marked on the tape is what's on the tape. Because remember, we're talking about a long period of time, and during that time GBC went through some pretty difficult periods when there wasn't as much money as other times, and tapes were reused, recycled until they were sort of not usable anymore, and therefore you have a curious situation where you have a lot of tapes which are nicely labelled but not necessarily reflect what's on the tape. And also tapes were used in bits, so there may be a lot of interesting stuff at the end of a tape as opposed to at the beginning of the tape that you don't expect. So at this stage we're just collating all the information that is on the tapes, on the tape box, and any information that might be with the tape. Then you have to see, of course, whether it's playable, because these tapes are very old. They've been through a few floods and a few awful things at Broadcasting House. So there's the next stage of digitization and finding out what's actually on it. And then after that, we can sort of drill down a little more and be more specific about places, faces, dates, and see what happens.
There are some difficulties because they're quite old, and they suffer from a sticky shed syndrome, where the magnetic material comes off the actual plastic tape. So in a lot of cases, because of moisture and age, we have to bake them to make them playable. And we do our best to get the highest quality out. So we transcode into uncompressed 10-bit format, and then we transcode again into IMX10, which allows the data to be compressed for ingest into the archive. So it's quite a process. It's real time, so if it's a 60-minute tape, it takes 60 minutes to do it.
Potentially there's a wealth of information to be explored, and at this stage there's cautious optimism.
I would suggest that we're actually being able to recover about 90% to 95% of the material. There are a few tapes that are damaged beyond repair. They've been subject to water, and sometimes they're quite rusty, and you can't play them in the machines. And because the machines are very rare these days, because they don't make them anymore and it's hard to get components, we have to be very careful with how we utilise them. So we have had a good success rate. We've only lost about 4 or 5% of the tapes so far. So it's a very, very good result, and the outputs have been very good.
There are some gems in there, some video material of people, of incidents, of circumstances from back in the early 80s and late 80s, which had been forgotten, and all of a sudden they get revived, and you look at them and it's infectious. You can't stop watching the video because it brings back so many memories.
Well, it'll take 12 months for us to fully appreciate what survived the test of time, with other tape formats waiting to be tackled. GBC has a programme to integrate its server system to an archive system, and when the transfer is complete, the task of indexing begins.